Okay, so where does cannabis act in the brain? Well, it turns out that cannabinoids act at cannabinoid receptors. And again, the cannabinoids were, initially phytocannabinoids that we, learned about in terms of their, effects, behavioral effects, cognitive effects, right? And then the next step was to identify where in the brain they were acting. So what are their receptor targets in the brain? Ultimately, we're going to see, the next question will be, as with opioids, well, then what endogenously do we produce? Do our brains produce that will act at those receptors that are then thus identified? But, this is, again, a story where we have a drug, in this case cannabis, that whose use goes back millennia, with known behavioral and cognitive and sort of perceptual effects. And then the next step is to find where in the brain are these cannabinoids, these phytocannabinoids, actually acting. And so two receptors have been identified. They're called cannabinoid receptors. The first one's called Cb1, Cannabinoid Receptor 1, and the second is Cannabinoid Receptor 2. And Cb1 has pretty widespread expression in the brain, so in the central nervous system. It's abundant. It's one of the most common metabotropic receptors that we've got out there, actually, in the central nervous system. It's expressed in high density in cerebellum, in the basal ganglia, in the hippocampus. Interestingly, even on like mitochondria in the hippocampus, hippocampal neurons, the brainstem, the spinal cord, and the neocortex. So CNS expression is in areas important for motor coordination, like cerebellum, basal ganglia, frontal lobe, for example. Memory, like hippocampus, medial temporal lobe structures, and we're going to see that cannabis or cannabinoids can have a big impact on short-term memory. Nausea, right? Because we're going to see it has some potential therapeutic use as an antiemetic, something to prevent you from vomiting, although there's also something called hyperemesis, which you don't want to get, where if you get too much cannabis, it can actually promote horrific, bouts of nonstop vomiting. So it definitely has impact in the brainstem, and there are areas that are involved in other parts of the central nervous system too, in terms of chemosensation and that feeling of nausea. Decision making, like in the frontal lobe, for example. Cb2 receptors are rather interesting. There are actually quite a number that are expressed in the peripheral nervous system and in components of the immune system, like the spleen and the thymus. So, there's some interesting, receptor targets, distributed around both the central nervous system and in the periphery as well.